Now, in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
My amendment is a manager's amendment to enhance in 2 ways this already very good bill. First, my amendment expands the bill's coverage. Instead of just covering executive orders with more than $1 billion in annual effect on the federal budget, it would also cover executive orders with overall economic impact on our nation's economy of $1 billion or more. We should have inflation impact assessments for executive orders with such significant economic effects. One such order, for example, would surely be Executive Order 13992, by which President Biden revoked President Trump's major regulatory reform orders. As we all know, President Trump's orders contributed massively to the booming economy America had during the last administration. Beyond doubt, their revocation inflicted more than $1 billion of annual harm on the economy. Their repeal also makes it harder for American companies to produce a host of goods and services. That will raise inflation by making those goods and services scarcer and more costly. Other good examples of executive orders: 13990 and 14008. These are whole-of-government executive orders by President Biden on climate policy. These orders canceled the Keystone Pipeline and launched a host of high-cost regulatory actions, particularly affecting energy. Those executive orders surely contributed to the sky-high energy inflation Americans have experienced under President Biden. The second way my amendment improves the bill is by requiring the House's inflation-impacted assessments to be reported not just to the House and Senate Budget Committees, but also to the House Oversight and Accountability Committee and the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. These committees of cross-cutting jurisdiction should receive these annual reports. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland
I rise to claim time in opposition, Madam Chair.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. The first thing I want to note about this amendment is that it now expands the definition of a major executive order to include those projected to cause an annual gross budgetary or economic effect of at least $1 billion, which includes those orders that would have a positive economic effect of $1 billion or more, thereby just adding a lot more paperwork, a lot more unnecessary bureaucratic entanglement. The distinguished chair of the Oversight Committee, I think, mentioned in passing the Biden administration's attempt to roll back some of the radical deregulatory program of the Trump administration, which undermined regulations favoring automobile safety, train safety, water safety, land safety. So again, we have what appears to be another clever talking point by the GOP, and the whole country is now up in arms over what took place in East Palestine, Ohio. We see precisely what the human effects and consequences are of their radical pro-corporate deregulatory agenda, dismantling the rules and regulations that protect public safety and public welfare. And that's really what's going on over there. It's not about having a couple of little analyses stuck onto executive order every 4 or 5 or 6 months. We know exactly what the real economic program is. And so this bill is a camouflage, just like this amendment is, and I would urge the body to oppose it, and I'm happy to yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I have no further speakers. I
The
yield
gentleman
back.
is recognized.
Yield back to
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kentucky. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those who oppose say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Starting in. It is now in order to consider amendment number 3, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Mrs. Boebert of Colorado.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 166, the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in favor of amendment number 3, which will require inflation impact assessments to be published on the Office of Management and Budget's website, not just reported to Congress. This simple, straightforward amendment will ensure that the American people who bear the brunt of inflation's impacts will be better informed of the President's inflation-inducing actions. Without my amendment, the real-life consequences of Joe Biden's spending spree in the White House will not be seen by those impacted most. This will provide transparency for the administration to answer to the American people. Thanks to Joe Biden's reckless spending agenda, America will spend $10 trillion more over the next 10 years than we were estimated to spend. While the federal government continues to spend trillions of dollars it doesn't have, inflation has hit a 40-year high and our nation is now mired in a recession. Instead of addressing these major economic concerns head-on, the Democrat solution to inflation is to keep on spending. The GOP majority has been empowered to hold the Biden administration accountable and demand transparency by revealing just how much Biden's executive orders are costing American families and small businesses. This excessive spending has real consequences. American families will pay an $8,581 inflation tax over the next year. Currently, 20 million Americans cannot pay their. We have seen a 4.3% decline in real wages since Biden took office. Americans have lost more than $2 trillion in retirement savings. Gas is nearly $4 a gallon again. And Americans are paying more for everything because of left-wing extremist policies. House Republicans are working to reduce inflation by fundamentally changing the way we vote on appropriations bills and putting an end to reckless spending omnibus packages passed on Christmas Eve without any time to actually read the bill. Multi-thousand-page bills spending trillions of dollars, about 24 hours or less to read it. We are working to cut wasteful spending, get to the bottom of fraudulent payments made by the federal government, support American energy production, and oppose tax increases proposed by the Democrats. Economic strength and job growth result from policies that unshackle job creators, allow American ingenuity, and provide certainty. I want to again thank my colleague, Chairwoman of the Republican Conference, Elise Stefanik, for her leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and vote in favor of the underlying bill. And with that, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. Who
Madam Chair?
seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek
I'm claiming the
recognition?
time in opposition, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's recognized.
You're very kind. Thank you. I want to just clear up a couple things. First, I heard the very distinguished gentlelady from Colorado mention job creators. I assume she was responding to President Biden, since 12 million new jobs have been created under President Biden, whereas millions of jobs were lost under the prior president, who may be a favorite of the gentleladies. I also wanted to make just a brief semantic point, because the gentlelady was making a grammatical error that I heard some of her colleagues make before. I believe she referred to a Democrat solution. I heard another member talk about a Democrat member and a Democrat plan. I just wanted to educate our distinguished colleagues that Democrat is the noun. When you use it as an adjective, you say the Democratic member, or the Democratic solution, or the Democratic plan. And so I assume it's a good faith grammatical error the first few times. But after people are corrected several times and they continue to say it, it seems like it's an act of incivility, as if every time we mentioned the other party, it just came out with a kind of political speech impediment like, oh, the Banana Republican Party, as if we were to say that every time we mentioned the Banana Republican member or the Banana Republican plan or the Banana Republican Conference. But we wouldn't do that. So out of pure political courtesy, when it's an adjective, refer to the Democratic Congresswoman or the Democratic member. Having said that, I'd like to say that I favor the Boebert amendment. I think it's really the Raskin amendment because none of them apparently caught the fact that their reporting requirement wasn't to be published until I told them. I actually read the bill and I said, you know, there's no publication of it. So this amendment follows through on the fact that I pointed out to them that their bill didn't even call for publication of the inflation information, which they thought was so essential. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to support the Boebert amendment because I think I'm the genesis of it. And with that, I'm happy to yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do just want to take a few seconds to respond. That was great. You know, we are addressed as MAGA extremists, extreme MAGA Republicans, and I would like to make just a clarification point. It's ultra MAGA. That's what we prefer. Yes, and but also, Mr. Ranking Member, reclaiming my time, Mr. Ranking Member, I am very happy that you have moved on from pronouns to adjectives, and you know, when you guys start acting democratic, I'll be sure to call you Democratic Party. Madam Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Chairman Comer.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the amendment. The Rein-In Act already ensures both the President and Congress receive the inflation impact assessment the bill requires. My colleague's amendment guarantees another vital recipient gets these assessments as well. That recipient is the American people who are bearing the brunt of Biden inflation. Once the White House assessments are posted on the Office of Management and Budget's website, plain as day, as my friend's amendment requires, the American people will be able to know and judge better for themselves how their president is impacting their daily lives. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The
Madam Chair, I
gentlewoman from
yield.
Colorado is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. It's the opinion of the chair. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The gentlewoman is recognized.
I would like to request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to the Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Colorado will be postponed. Is that right? Now, in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in the House Report 118-4, for what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Mr. Cloud of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The intent of the Rein-In Act is to ensure that the executive branch is taking into account inflation in our country before they issue new regulations. Our country has seen the rising inflation over the last 2 years, and inflation is affecting all of us. It's affecting our families, especially those with lower incomes who don't have as much of a cushion to deal with what we're seeing as they face increasing costs, especially in gas and in groceries. But as we consider the cost of inflation, we should also consider the cost of debt servicing in what we're doing, because too often we as a government don't do the same thing that we expect our families to do, and that when someone goes to purchase a car, for example, or a house, they have to include the cost of interest that they're going to pay on those kind of things. We regularly ignore that as if it wasn't an important part of what we spend on, when in fact it's about $600 billion of spending annually. This is why I offered my amendment to the Rein-In Act. My amendment would amend the bill to direct the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Economic Advisors to incorporate inflationary impact of debt servicing costs into the reports that they create. Rising interest rates have the same effect on costs of spending on the national result as well. We see rising interest rates have the same meaning for our countries as the families that we encounter. But in order to accurately account for what we're spending, we cannot ignore the cost of debt servicing or the real cost that will be accrued with new spending. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget released a report today that estimated net interest will total $10.5 trillion over the next decade. As lawmakers, we have a duty to be honest about the effects of our actions, and this amendment will keep us honest about the true effects of our spending. I encourage support of my amendment and the underlying legislation as well, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland
Madam Chair, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you so much. And ask if the gentleman would be willing to yield for a couple of questions, because again, there was no hearing in committee, so I'm not sure I understand this. This might be a great idea, but I want to try to figure it out. It requires that any inflationary estimates prepared incorporate the inflationary impact of debt servicing costs, which seems perfectly logical to me. But is there a reason to think that the current inflation rate, as defined by the U.S. government, does not incorporate the inflationary impact of debt servicing costs?
Yes, it's been regular practice with CBO. I've been working to get this done for the CBO as well since I've got here in Congress. It's the common practice among all the entities that we look for wisdom and advice and guidance on budgeting and spending, that the cost of debt servicing is not counted into their projections. And
and that's true across the board in terms of all of the economic indicators that we read about, whether it's the OMB
information that we get to take into account, like when we're evaluating a bill and what we think the 10-year projected cost is, yes, typically it does not include the debt servicing cost.
Okay, to reclaim my time, and thank you for your kind answers, sir. You know, this really is why we have hearings in Congress, because it feels like we're just posting a lot of graffiti on a wall here. I don't know how the inflation rate is calculated. I don't know whether the import of this amendment would be to double count debt servicing costs, because I don't know which government agencies actually incorporate debt servicing costs and which don't. One thing I do know is that if the gentleman has the greatest amendment of the year, it's still basically irrelevant because it does nothing. In other words, it's not going to do anything to bring down anybody's debt servicing costs, which I agree are huge. Unlike, for example, what the Biden administration has done in terms of student debt by acting dramatically to bring it down, even though there are people from across the aisle who are in court today, I believe, trying to get that thrown out and trying to bring everybody's student loan debt back up. That's real economic action. In any event, what this is about is pure symbolism. In other words, they're asking for a reporting bill that will only apply if there's $1 billion plus impact. And the good gentleman comes forward to say, well, make sure, Mr. President, when you're doing your calculations, you include debt servicing costs. Well, I don't know. You could take it or leave it. It doesn't do anything for people who are staggering under debt the way that the Biden administration is trying to act, for example, to deal with the problem of student debt, or the way that we've acted to try to help people who are suffering under mortgage debt. That's real economic action. So with that, I'm just going to have to consider it carefully given the information we have. But I will end with a plea for the good chairman of the Oversight Committee, the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky, we have to have hearings on these bills so we know what we're talking about, because I feel like we're dancing in the dark here. I'll reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, I would once again point out that we spend approximately $600 billion a year in interest payments, yet we do not count the cost of what the debt servicing will cost in anything we do. Now, that's in short order expected to eclipse our military spending, which is our #1 constitutional priority for our federal spending. So whatever we want to do up here, if we do not begin to count the real cost of what we're doing, we will be off. And right now we are having to deal with a debt ceiling issue because the previous Congress decided to spend without considering the cost of what it was going to take and to push us toward the limit. And so we are cognizant of the fact that we are spending. We're going to monitor our spending in a way that we leave a better country for our kids and for our grandkids, and this is part of making sure that we are actually counting the real cost of what we're doing as we take each step. And I would like to yield a minute to the distinguished chair of the Oversight Committee, my good friend Comer from Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the amendment. Often when inflation is considered, people fail to consider one of its important effects. That effect is on how much more it costs taxpayers to pay interest on our federal debt. Those interest payments are high, and they spike higher when interest rates rise. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the federal government would pay $400 billion in interest on the federal debt during fiscal year 2022. And the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget projected at the time that for every 1% increase in interest rates, those annual payments would rise by $38 billion. Remember, that's for fiscal year 2022, when the federal debt and interest rates were lower than they are now. My colleague amendment makes sure the impact on the federal debt service costs will not be overlooked in the inflation impact assessments the bill requires. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I just repeat my puzzlement from before. Perhaps if Mr. could yield for another question, what is the inflationary impact of debt servicing costs? Have there been any economic studies on that?
What we're trying to do is to make sure that the debt servicing cost is included into these studies we're getting. You know, eventually I have a bill, for example, to do it with the Congressional Budget Office, so we'd like to see that as well. This would make sure that we're getting this done in the REINS Act with the OMB and the Council on Economic Advisors. And so it's common sense. To me, this should be bipartisan. We should really be counting the cost of what we're actually spending. This isn't really meant to be a controversial bill, except for those who don't want to really know what we're actually spending.
Reclaiming my time, I would just say, I think you raise a very interesting point. I would love to know the answer to whether or not it's actually incorporated today and what the inflationary or deflationary effects are of debt servicing costs. And obviously this bill and this amendment would not have any impact on what those debt servicing costs are, but I don't see much of a problem of adding this language to the hortatory nature of the legislation. Happy to reserve.
The gentleman reserves from Texas.
Yeah, and if I would just add, it may not change what we're doing, but it would change the knowledge of what we're doing here in Congress. And the fact that we continue to spend money without even knowing how much money we're spending, I think is a problem, and certainly not the due diligence that we should have as members of Congress, being diligent with the public trust that we've been given. And so us having the real cost estimates before us is going to be very valuable as we go forward to understand exactly what we're doing as we begin to evaluate legislation, and for the administration when they're dealing with regulations they're proposing.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Yes, I yield.
The gentleman from Maryland.
Madam Chair, I'll just close on this one with this thought. The majority comes forward with a plan to say we want to know an estimated inflationary impact of an executive order, and then we have a series of Christmas tree amendment saying, and make sure you include the cost to rural areas, make sure you include the cost of
Time
debt
has
servicing.
expired.
I would like the overall cost. Thank you. Yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those who oppose say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. If the gentlewoman will the gentlewoman would suspend. The chair understands that amendment number 5 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, thank you so very much. For those of us who've had the privilege of serving in the United States Congress for a period of time, going through any number of speakers and majorities, what we're doing this evening in the midst of the needs of the American people is deja vu. Let me briefly just say that the Congressional Review Act process, which we debated just a few hours ago, would have added a 60-day review period on crucial life-saving executive orders that would have been necessary or have been necessary to save lives and to improve the quality of life of the American people, in this instance, rulemaking. So it's an obstructionist. It was passed. The Congressional Review Act, obstruction, some 60-day review period, adding a Senate vote, House vote, a veto, coming back again when American lives are in jeopardy, for health care, for the environment, for labor laws, any number of things, for criminal justice reform, any number of rules that would create a better pathway for Americans. Now we come, of course, with the RAIN Act. And I was positive that we did the RAIN Act some years ago. Sounds very familiar. And this one deals with allegedly providing some pathway for dealing effectively with inflation. I would hope my colleagues will be as interested in raising the debt ceiling, which will stop the bleeding of the American people and busting their wallets open because we have refused to pay our bills. This seems to ignore the work that President Biden has done, taken to cut everyday costs for working families, bring global supply chains back in, alleviating debt for students and veterans, and fighting climate change. This part of their larger plan, security and other crucial programs, are in this bill. My amendment and the language would eliminate, by eliminating the language that we did in my amendment, further helps to ensure that improper and ambiguous congressional interference in executive orders as sought through this legislation is appropriately curtailed. And so that the executive orders that are well vetted by the President of the United States, that have helped populations who have been in trouble, that have brought about a reckoning of police reform, that these executive orders would not be interfered with under the pretense of trying to suggest an inflationary impact. Why not applaud the work that President Biden has done, as I said, with alleviating the debt of students and veterans, of which there are those now fighting this in the Supreme Court, the work he's done on climate change, and the work we have all done, Democrats and the President, to preserve Medicare, Social Security, and other critical programs. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee Amendment, number 6, to stop the interference that has no benefit and impact on any inflationary uptick. What we need to do is to work together to provide a budget, to be able to overview the budget, and to be able to come together to raise the debt ceiling to pay America's bills. I ask my colleagues to support Amendment number 6. With that, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
The amendment strikes the bill's requirement for an inflation impact assessment when an executive order will have a significant impact on inflation. But the impact cannot yet be precisely quantified. That is exactly the wrong approach to take if the White House can determine an executive order will indeed have a significant impact on inflation. That is what is important. The President should know about that before he acts. It would be unwise and dangerous to happily let the President proceed in the dark about an order's inflationary impacts just because they cannot yet be calculated with perfect precision. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Texas.
How much time do I have?
The gentlelady has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Does the gentleman have any other speakers? Again, this is deja vu. I know the intent of this legislation, Reduce Exacerbated Inflation Negatively Impacting the Nation Act. What I would say is that my amendment clearly wants to take away destructive interference on the work that the executive has to do through vetting their executive orders by not insisting on extra baggage that would not in any way provide any relief to inflation. What will provide relief to inflation would be to ensure that the debt of students is reduced, that veterans are protected, that Medicare and Social Security are protected, that the debt ceiling is raised. And so my amendment by eliminating the language, further helps to ensure that improper and ambiguous congressional interference with executive orders as sought through this legislation is appropriately curtailed, because the more you delay constructive executive orders to help the American people, then the more you undermine the relief of the American people and help to bring down the inflation. With that, I yield back and ask support for the Jackson-Lee amendment.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those who oppose say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentlewoman from Texas.
With that, I request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to...
Does the gentlewoman request a recorded vote?
Does the gentlewoman request a recorded vote?
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Ms. Jackson-Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes gentlewoman from Texas.
Madam Chair, we cannot run the government by ambiguity, confusion, lack of clarity, and just throwing language down on the floor and expecting all of the pieces of government to work together. I question whether this legislation and the legislation dealing with the Congressional Review Act is ever going to be passed in the United States Senate. I question that. It would have been nice to have hearings and to work together. But this amendment tries to bring clarity. My amendment tries to define the term significant impact. And it adds the term significant impact on inflation means an executive order was estimated to increase or decrease consumer price index inflation by at least 1 percentage point over the course of a year. This amendment thus clarifies that the meaning of significant impact on inflation is quantifiable in any effort to make such a determination. The lack of specificity of applicability for when this unnecessary legislative restriction would take place and mandate will be imposed on all executive orders as provided for in the bill is unnecessary, time-consuming, and a waste of resources. In fact, I don't even know how any president would get through it. I'm not saying that executive orders should not have their necessary oversight, and they can. The Oversight Committee and other jurisdictional committees can have oversight. But if this is to reduce inflation, all this bill will do is to raise the costs of any act or action that is asked for in the executive order. Including the Jackson-Lee Amendment 26 would help to ensure that any attempt to restrict the powers and authority of executive orders is curtailed in a manner that would limit such mandate to apply only in such scenario whereby economically accepted standards are considered and applied. Example, whereby significant impact on inflation is limited to instances where there has been an increase or decrease in the Consumer Price Index, CPI, inflation by at least 1% over the course of a year. With that in mind, we would have clarity. We would have an understanding. We would be able to know whether this is irrelevant, burdensome, and overly excessive in doing the work on behalf of the American people. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment, number 7, and I reserve.
The gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment. This amendment defines a significant impact on inflation as only an impact that would increase or decrease the Consumer Price Index by at least 1 percentage point. Now, with all due respect, that's magical thinking. If a single executive order were to produce a full 1 percentage point increase in inflation, that would be not just a significant effect, it would be a massive effect. The Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation data from January 23, 2023 showed that the Consumer Price Index rose 6.4% over the prior year. A 1 percent point rise would constitute 16% of that yearly rise. That is a huge portion of yearly inflation. Few individual executive orders, even ones that stoke inflation significantly, would on their own raise inflation by 1 full percentage point or more. And so we see what the amendment really is trying to do is gut the bill. And I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman, the ranking member of the Oversight Committee.
How much time, sir?
How much time do I have?
Yes. Woman has 2.5 minutes remaining.
For such time as he may consume, and I'll take a few seconds after that.
Yeah, but I just wanted to speak in strong support of the gentlelady's amendment. I want to thank Ms. Jackson-Lee for her leadership in terms of real economic policy, which is about making the government an instrument of well-being and the public good. And we know we have serious philosophical differences with our friends across the aisle. Many of them wanted to dismantle Social Security and Medicare. I think when President Biden arrived the other day, a lot of them retreated very quickly from it. I'd be delighted if someone wants to challenge me on that, because we have all the quotations from all the Republican senators and representatives who said it was time to get rid of Social Security, phase it out, adopt means testing, increase the age, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's a real policy difference. What they've done here, I think, it really falls under the category of symbolic politics, but the good gentlelady from Texas has done her best to make this meaningful, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that, and I yield back to Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas reserves her time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
Very
Gentlewoman
quick,
from Texas.
Very quickly, I thank the gentleman from Maryland for further clarifying our intent. Usually inflation by the economists is somewhere around 2%. So to have this amendment that indicates 1%, it gives some clarity of a significant impact. And I would say this, I believe in oversight, but I don't believe in obstruction and intrusion and stopping work that impacts the American people. My amendment provides clarity so that the work for the American people can go forward, and it is evident that President Biden has had a significant impact on bringing down inflation and building a better quality of life. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee Amendment number 7.
The gentlelady yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. Yes, gentlewoman from Texas.
Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 8, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 8.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Madam Chair, all of us have seen the great work of the Oversight Committee in the 2 initiatives that we have had today. And clearly, we're all sort of stretching to try to understand the impact of the Reduce Exacerbated Inflation Negatively Impacting the Nation Act, and we're trying to find the substance. And so my previous amendment was dealing with significant. Now we're dealing with quantifiable inflationary impact. And I wanted to add as to what this actually means. And so my amendment says quantifiable inflationary impact means an executive order was estimated to increase or decrease consumer price index inflation by at least 1% percentage point over the course of a year, knowing that inflation is usually 2% a year. I'm just trying to find light in darkness and to help try to understand what this bill is doing and to give those who are in government to do good, those who are trying to solve problems with a legitimate executive order, to have some guidance that relates to inflation and not be of no substance with a bottomless pit, to be very honest with you. I'm hoping my colleagues will join me in trying to give some guidance, some quantifiable definition to quantifiable inflationary input by tracking it to what has traditionally been by economists, inflation 2%. We just went to 1% to give some definition to this, to give some ability for anyone to understand how to analyze or utilize this legislation if it ever gets to the President's desk. With that, I reserve.
The gentlewoman from Texas reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
This amendment is similar to my colleague's last amendment. It defines a, quote, quantifiable inflationary impact as only an impact that would increase or decrease the consumer price index by at least 1 percentage point. If a given executive order did not have that level of impact, the bill, if amended this way, would require no inflation impact assessment. But as my colleague's prior amendment, this amendment would not improve the bill, but instead gut the bill, letting off the hook all executive orders with less than 1 percentage point impact on the consumer price index. It would mean that all or virtually all orders would be off the hook. That includes those with obviously significant inflationary effects. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Does the gentleman have any further speakers?
We do not.
So are you prepared to yield back? In conclusion,
The gentleman from New York yields back.
Yes, we yield to the remainder of our time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
as I close and conclude, let me quickly say, again, the Jackson Lee Amendment before us is keeping in line with nationally recognized standards. Many economists agree that a quantifiable inflationary impact is deemed to occur when there is an increase or decrease in the consumer price index inflation by at least 1% and over the course of the year. It will not gut the bill. It will let us try to understand the bill. While H.R. 347 is a clear overreach and would impose improper and onerous restrictions upon the executive branch, the Jackson Lee Amendment tries to find some common ground that will be offered to this body as a mere attempt to help ensure that the inappropriate limitations as prescribed by this legislation are curtailed in its effort to limit the authority of the executive orders. I ask my colleagues to consider and vote for the Jackson Lee Amendment number 8.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
So next is going to be Ms. Lee of Nevada.
Now, in order to consider amendment number 9, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Nevada seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 9, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Mrs. Lee of Nevada.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Lee, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong support of my amendment to H.R. 347, the Reduce Exacerbated Inflation Negatively Impacting the Nation Act. My amendment underscores the fact that it is not the sole responsibility of the Executive Office of the President to reduce inflation, but that productive bipartisan legislative action is the best way that we can collectively combat inflation and bring down the cost of living. I represent Southern Nevada, a part of the country that has been especially hit hard by the price hikes driven up by the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Nevada families have been hurting, and they have been forced to make difficult decisions about how to make ends meet, how to provide for their loved ones for far too long. And they are tired of finger pointing. They're done with partisan pot shots and bickering that achieve nothing to help them make ends meet. Although the pace of inflation has slowed since hitting a peak last summer, the cost of living continues to remain far too high. And that's why they and the rest of America are calling on Congress for us to do our job, to take real action and provide relief. And that's what we owe them. We made progress in this direction during the last Congress with the CHIPS and Science Act, the bipartisan infrastructure package, and other landmark bills that continue to help strengthen our supply chains and relieve price pressures. This Congress, we need to continue that legacy and set aside political posturing and instead advance more thoughtful legislation that will actually bring down costs and meet the needs of our constituents. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Congress is at our best when we put policy first and politics last. I implore all of my colleagues to support this amendment because finding bipartisan compromise and real progress on our nation's most pressing issue is not only right, it is what we were sent here to do. And with that, I will recognize Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much. I want to rise in favor of Ms. Lee's excellent amendment here, which makes both a powerful economic point and a powerful constitutional point. The economic point is that Congress must act in order to bring down inflation. Congress must act in order to promote employment, and we have acted in partnership with President Biden to do just that in the Inflation Reduction Act, in the Infrastructure Act, in a whole series of bills that we have used to bring inflation down, to dramatically lower unemployment in the country. But she's making also, I believe, a very powerful constitutional point, because part of what gets lost in the symbolism of this legislation, a mere messaging bill about having executive orders over $1 billion, which describes a handful in a year, attach an inflation description. What gets lost is that the Constitution in Article 1 sets it up so that Congress is the major definer of economic policy in the country. It's Congress that is supposed to be laying and collecting taxes and imposts and dealing with the debt of the country. It's Congress that regulates commerce among the states and with foreign countries. So the failure to come forward with real productive legislation on inflation is also a surrender to the executive branch. And we don't need to do that. So we should be working with the executive branch, as we have done in the Inflation Reduction Act, with the infrastructure bill, in lowering prescription drug costs, in lowering the cost for diabetics to get their insulin shots to $35 a month. That is the real pathway, not just a bunch of reporting bills. Thank you for yielding, and I'm happy to yield back to Ms. Lee.
Thank you. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Nevada reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this amendment.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
My colleague's amendment states an obvious fact. It is the responsibility of both the President and the House of Representatives to combat inflation. And I have no quarrel with that. In fact, in advancing this bill, the House is taking one step towards fulfilling its responsibility to combat inflation. It's doing so by using this legislative authority to help ensure that the President focuses on combating inflation, not issuing executive orders that make inflation worse. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentlewoman from Nevada is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm ready to close.
The gentlewoman is recognized. The question is on. Nope. Okay. Is the gentlewoman yielding back?
Oh, I yield back, yes.
Okay. The gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from New York?
We yield back as well.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Nevada. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Could I ask for a recorded vote, please?
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Nevada will be postponed.
So this is going to be New York. Sorry, that's scratch.
It is now in order to consider amendment number 10, printed in House Report 118-4. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the designee of Mr. Andy Ogles, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 10, printed in House Report number 118-4, offered by Mr. Langworthy of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 166, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Langworthy, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. My colleague's amendment makes sure that inflation assessments prepared under the bill will address a critical inflationary measure, the producer price index. Now, when people think of inflation, they usually think of the consumer price index, but the producer price index is critical as well. It measures changes in the selling prices domestic producers receive for their output. These prices are from the very first commercial transactions for many products and services. Thus, changes in the producer price index can signal that changes in prices are about to ripple through the economy. They should be accounted for in each inflation impact assessment that the bill requires. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Claiming time in opposition, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
As far as I understand, the amendment just adds one more unnecessary detail to the report, creating greater administrative burden at a taxpayer cost that is still undefined. It's unclear why it's necessary. If it is necessary, it should be adopted across the board. But of course, we had no hearing, so we can't really understand what the merits of the proposal are. But right now, it just seems like a lot more bureaucratic paperwork. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we have no more speakers at this time, and I yield back the remainder of our time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
And I'm happy also to yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 347, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole of the House on the State of the Union reports that committee has had under consideration H.R. 347 and has come to no resolution thereon. Is the microphone on? Members of the chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to bring attention to the fact that when Norfolk Southern's train derailed next to my district, leaking chemicals, evacuating constituents, distressing thousands, the people of Western PA were mad, and so was I. That's why my first bill in Congress is to take on the railroads. Today, my colleague Mr. Khanna and I introduced the Derail Act, which ensures trains carrying hazardous materials are properly classified and have increased safety requirements. It's long overdue, but rail industry lobbyists have fought against it. This derailment included hazardous materials, but since the train wasn't classified properly, it didn't have stricter safety rules. That's why we need the Derail Act. This bill is for everyone in Beaver County and East Palestine. It's for everyone who's heard about this derailment and thought, could this happen here? The terrible reality is, yes, it could. But if colleagues from both parties join together, it doesn't have to. Let's tell the railroads we won't let them recklessly pursue profit and endanger our communities and workers. I'll keep fighting to hold Norfolk Southern accountable for every penny of pain they've caused. I yield back.
Does the gentle lady from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentle lady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on the last day of Black History Month to celebrate the remarkable contributions of Black business owners. Business ownership leads to higher incomes and more wealth, but decades of systemic bias, redlining, lending discrimination, and inequity in wages have created an ever-widening wealth gap for minority communities. According to the Alliance for Entrepreneurial Equity, Black-owned businesses are 3 to 5 times more likely to be labeled as a high credit risk, which sets up barriers to affordable financing and slows growth. During the height of the pandemic, minority-owned firms were more likely to be completely shut out of credit and capital resources, receiving none of the financing they sought out. This Black History Month, I met with entrepreneurs in my district who drive our economy forward. People like Malik Muhammad, owner of an independent bookstore in Baldwin Hills. Malik is passionate about investing in the community and does so by hosting book fairs at local schools, because he knows that in order for his neighborhood to thrive, more people of color need to start businesses in the community. I urge my colleagues in Congress to recognize the great strength that is Black entrepreneurship and work with me to build a more equitable economy for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. For what purpose does the gentle lady from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentle lady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I stand before you proud of Pennsylvania, proud of my Democratic colleagues in the Pennsylvania House, proud of the thousands of volunteers who helped deliver a State House majority last November in Pennsylvania, a House majority that on this last Black History Month day is celebrating history, or should I say her story, Pennsylvania made today. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate and celebrate Representative Joanna McClinton, my colleague, my friend, and as of today, Speaker of the Pennsylvania House, the first woman, the first African-American woman to be called Madam Speaker. Speaker McClinton follows in the footsteps of men like Leroy Irvis, the first African-American Speaker of the Pennsylvania House, and African-American trailblazers like Barbara Jordan and Karen Bass. What a crucial time in our state's history, in our nation's history, to have Speaker McClinton lead us. A time when we can fairly fund our education, rebuild roads, combat gun violence and the opioid epidemic while protecting our planet for our children and children to come. Joanna, a mother, a minister, a former public defender, now our Speaker. What a way to end Black History Month. Congratulations to the Pennsylvania House. Congratulations and Godspeed, Speaker McClinton. I yield back.
Thank you very much. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to the House floor to address the House floor for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to introduce my bill, the SALT Relief Act. My bill will increase the state and local taxes cap deduction from $10,000 to $50,000. By increasing the SALT deduction is a step in the right direction to lessen the burden of combined federal and state local taxes during these times of economic hardship. New York has one of the highest tax rates in the country, ranking above, including federal, state, and local taxes. In 2018, for Nassau County, the average SALT amount, property tax liability income, or sales tax liability, reported amongst itemizing filers was $30,227,000.21. But due to the $10,000 cap, the average SALT deduction actually claimed $9,023.79. Let it be known that the SALT tax is not a tax break for the wealthy, but a tax relief for working class families. This is about the 118th Congress working to ease the affordability burden in high-tax states like New York. While the cost of living continues to plague New Yorkers, and by raising the cap SALT tax will provide real tax relief, not just to New York's 3rd Congressional District, but to all in America. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Additional calls for 1 minute speeches, additional members for 1 minute speeches. Hearing none, under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader. You are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Tonight we're going to try to do sort of the continuation on the theme, but we're going to actually end it up with a dozen or so solutions. I know the parliamentarians said I can't hold my 8-month-old, but I wanted to prove the 8-month-old was real. Look, there's some realities. I keep coming behind these microphones to try to explain, and I continue to be just enraged, particularly my brothers and sisters on the left, the avoidance of the math. My little boy who's 8 months old, in 25 years, according to the CBO, his taxes will have to be doubled. Corporate taxes will have to be doubled. Tariffs will have to be doubled. Everything has to double just to maintain baseline services. That's the math. How many discussions have you heard here, even today, over the last month? The reality of the math, and the math will always win. So once again, I'm going to walk through some of what's really going on. And for everyone here who says, we're going to balance in 10 years. Okay, I can do it, but you got to understand the amount of bloodletting that's required to actually make that math work. And the actual structural problem is actually not on the left, not on the right, it's demographics. Something we are terrified. And what the president did in his State of the Union speech was just unconscionable. You know, when he basically used Social Security and Medicare as props for his reelection, instead of telling the truth, in a decade, the Medicare Trust Fund is gone. In a decade, the Social Security Trust Fund is gone. Does the left plan to help us fix it? Because if they don't, they get to be responsible for doubling senior poverty in this country. It's the math. So once again, I've started with this board now for multiple years, and the new numbers are coming out, and they're actually worse. The United States functionally has $114 trillion of borrowing. And it's every dime of it is Social Security and Medicare. The rest of the budget actually has a positive balance. We got old. Look, I'm a gray hair with a child. Maybe I'm pathologically optimistic. But it's hard to fix a problem when you work in a place where your brothers and sisters there will not look you in the eye and say, I understand the driver of our debt is our demographics. And we will get people, and for those of you, if this ends up on YouTube, read the comments. Look at about half the folks get it. About half the folks, it's just heartbreaking, the absurdities. Tax rich people, that takes care of it. Get rid of congressional salaries. We actually did the math. The funny thing is if you get rid of all the Senate salaries, House salaries, it's 28 minutes of borrowing, and that was last year's number. In 10 years, it's like 12 minutes of borrowing. People have no concept. You can get rid of every dime of foreign aid, and it's about 12 days of the borrowing. So let's actually start to walk through to understand structurally how much trouble we're actually in. Reducing the discretionary spending to zero. So remember, the point I'm trying to make here is you just got rid of all the military. You just got rid of the White House. You just got rid of Congress. You just got rid of the Supreme Court. You got rid of the EPA. You got rid of the IRS. You got rid of everything. All discretionary money. The only thing you're paying is Medicare, Social Security, the earned benefits, some of the Medicaid, veterans benefits, so what we call mandatory around here. When you get to about 10 years, so remember, you've just wiped out of government. All you are doing is paying the benefits. When you actually remove all the mandatory, you're still having to borrow a couple $100 billion. So when the clown show comes and says, if we just got rid of this or that, we would be fine, it's not true. Your government functionally is an insurance company with an army. an insurance company that technically is broke. So let's walk through some of the math. And I'm going to do this over and over and see maybe one of these slides will actually help sink in. And I got to throw out something else. It's just annoying. The room is empty. That's okay. People are in their offices working. We're on thousands of televisions around this place.